Introduce you to Bill Barnhart. He is a co-author of John Paul Stevens' An Independent Life. Mr. Barnhart served at the Chicago Tribune for several years as a columnist. Mr. Barnhart, 35 years. John Paul Stevens has been on the High Court. Why no extensive biography until now of him?
That's a good question. I think primarily because he really has no interest in biography. I doubt that he ever solicited anyone to write his biography he doesn't really court the press in any way, shape, or form. He's very much an unknown figure, to be honest with you, on the court. He hasn't, his name is not associated with any great case. Most of his work, frankly, his best work is in dissent, which doesn't lend itself to a lot of publicity. So I think those factors come into play. Nonetheless, I think there's a great story there.
What's he going to be remembered for as far as his judicial opinions?
I think he'll be remembered for being a very, very precise analyst of the law and analyst of cases. He was a lawyer in Chicago. He had one of his favorite characters in literature was Perry Mason, and he really believes in understanding the evidence, understanding the facts. A lot of judges nowadays, and I think even in the past, came to the court with preconceived ideas about what the law is. He's one judge that let the facts and the law tell him what is, not his preconceived ideas. And I think that will be remembered fondly.
Well, your subtitle is An Independent Life, but you also write in here about his switch to becoming a liberal.
Yes.
What happened?
The statistics that are compiled by academics about how the court swings left to right and so on showed that in the first 10 years he was pretty much right down the middle. He was conservative one year and liberal the next. About the time of the so-called Reagan Revolution, when President Reagan came into power and began to appoint some justices, the statistics in his case started the shift to the left. Now he denies that he changed. He says the court changed. But I'm not so sure. I think he did begin to see the law as more of an effort to move things forward rather than simply to in a restrained way, strictly construct the law and so on. So I think there was a shift there, maybe in reaction to the Reagan appointees.
You talk quite a bit about the Texas versus Johnson case and how that surprised everybody. What was that case, very briefly, and what was John Paul Stevens' role and what did he write?
Yeah, we began with that case because it's a case that's counterintuitive. Most people think of Stevens as the leading liberal on the court. This was a case in which he, in dissent again, ruled that a Texas law banning the burning of the U.S. flag should be permitted and that the law was not unconstitutional under free speech rights. We talked about that a great deal because, first of all, it's contrary to the liberal image, and secondly, it reflects his great feeling about this country, I think arising from his service in World War II and so on. But it was sort of an outlier case, but one I think that tells a lot about him.
Did he cooperate with this book? You seem to have a lot of personal photos in here.
Well, his father left papers and family photos to the Chicago History Museum, and we had full access to those. That was wonderful. In fact, one of his only surviving brother, who has since died, unfortunately, came to the museum with us and helped us identify the people in the pictures, which was just enormously helpful. He lived in the Chicago area for many years. But no, he did not participate in long interviews. He was very gracious. We did interview him briefly on several occasions. He did nothing to stand in our way, which he could have done. People who were being interviewed would call him and they would say, should we talk to these guys? And he would say, do whatever you want. He didn't say yes or no. So in that sense, he was helpful.
But you talked to his three daughters.
Yes. Yes, he had three daughters. There was one son who died, unfortunately, before the project was undertaken. And then he has children by his second marriage as well.
And who is his first wife, and who is his second wife here that we're seeing a picture of right now?
Betty was the first wife. They got married shortly after he enlisted in the Navy, which was not unusual in those days. men going off to the war, I think often wanted to have some attachment, I guess you might say. And they were together until he went on the Supreme Court. And then in 1979, they divorced, and he married a woman named Mary Ann, who actually he had known back in Chicago when he lived here, and they've been together ever since.
He was born in Chicago in 1920. The Stevens family
Yes.
is well known in Chicago, correct?
Well, it is by some. I often tell people if you want to understand the Stevens family, just go to the what is now the Hilton Chicago Hotel on South Michigan Avenue. It's a massive hotel. That was built as the Stevens Hotel. It was built by John Paul's father and grandfather, and it was at the time said to be the biggest hotel in the world. It was luxurious and so on. So yes, they were very prominent.
And what happened to his father?
Well, the family got into trouble at the time of the Depression because they also owned an insurance company. And some of the policyholders of the insurance company claimed that the family was, in effect, looting the insurance assets to pay the debts of the hotel. That's a very shorthand version of the story. And the father and grandfather were both indicted for embezzlement as a result. And the father, whose name was Ernest, was convicted by a jury in Chicago. Now, the case was overturned ultimately by the Illinois Supreme Court, but at the time it got a lot of headlines. It was around the same time as the infamous Sam Insull, the utility magnate, was in the news, and so there's a lot of bitter memories about that in the family.
Was John Paul Stevens an active politico here in Chicago?
No, not at all. His family was definitely Republican, and the voting records from when he lived in Illinois suggest that he voted Republican as well, but he was in no way involved in any way in party politics. Frankly, I think he was just too busy earning a living as a lawyer. He had no interest in it.
Then how did he rise up to the Supreme Court?
Well, that's what the book is about, actually. The first step was to get himself on the U.S. Court of Appeals here in Chicago. And he did that really through the back door. The senator from Illinois at the time, who was the senior senator, Charles Percy, was a Republican, but he was trying to establish himself as someone who would pick independent individuals to be on the court. And he found Stevens as such a person. As it turned out, he and Stevens had gone to college together at the University of Chicago. But there's no evidence at all that that friendship was what led to his being appointed. It was really an appointment based solely on merit, and I know that may be hard to believe these days, but that is literally the truth.
What was his nomination process like in 1975 when President Ford nominated him?
Very different than today. First of all, he is the last justice to have gone through the confirmation process without television coverage. There was no live coverage of his confirmation hearing, and he's very thankful for that. Secondly, it was at a time, as you may recall, after the Watergate episode, President Ford was in office. He was very concerned about not politicizing the Supreme Court or in any way having politics connected with the judicial system. So he wanted to pick someone who did not have any political baggage. And there were many people who wanted to be on the court to replace William O. Douglas. He was the retiring justice. But Ford, in my view, to his great credit, picked Stevens, who had absolutely no political baggage. And in fact, very few people even knew who he was. Nowadays, that would probably not happen.
But what was the, did he go before the Senate Judiciary Committee?
Oh yes, there was a brief hearing. I think there was just a few weeks transpired between the nomination and the confirmation. He was confirmed unanimously. There was, it's interesting, he was the first justice appointed or nominated after the Roe v. Wade abortion decision, which became so critical, and yet the subject never came up at his confirmation hearing. That shows you how, frankly, the public wasn't all that interested in the Supreme Court at that time, and it just wasn't a point of controversy.
And what was the vote?
His confirmation was 98-0, as I recall. So there was no opposition. The only opposition, frankly, came from what was then the burgeoning women's movement. They were concerned about some of his rulings here in Chicago on the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals. But other than that, there was really no controversy.